she pressed a dead woman's ring onto her own trembling finger and told herself it wasn't truly a lie if she never spoke the words aloud. But standing at the top of those church steps, staring down at a man who believed with his whole quiet heart that he was about to marry someone else entirely, Amelia Carter felt the truth rise in her chest like floodwater. Cold, unstoppable, and far too late to hold back. Some deceits are made in a single desperate moment, but they are lived for a lifetime. If this story already has your heart pulling, please subscribe to our channel and follow Amelia's journey all the way to the end, because this one doesn't go where you think it will. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see just how far this story has traveled. The church was full. Amelia knew it without looking. She could hear them. The rustle of silk skirts, the low murmur of voices beneath the organ's steady drone, and the particular kind of silence that falls when a crowd of people all think the same suspicious thing at the same moment, but are too well-bred to say it out loud. She stood just outside the double doors, with her hands folded in front of her, and her heart hammering so hard against her ribs, she was almost certain the man beside her could feel it through his sleeve. Mr. Whitmore couldn't feel much of anything anymore, she suspected. He had burned that capacity out of himself, somewhere around the time he started treating people like ledger entries. "You look fine," he said. She said nothing. Celeste always held her chin up. "Hold your chin up." "Mr. Whitmore." Her voice came out very quiet, very flat. "Celeste has been in the ground for 3 weeks. He turned to look at her. His eyes were pale and dry and entirely unbothered. "Celeste Whitmore," he said, "is standing right beside me in a white dress, and she is about to walk through those doors and save what's left of this family's name. Are we clear?" The organ swelled. The doors opened. Amelia walked through. She kept her eyes forward and her chin exactly where the man had told her to put it, and she moved the way Celeste had moved. She'd studied it long enough to know every detail. The angle of the shoulders, the deliberate, unhurried pace, the way her hands hung quiet and still at her sides. She had spent 2 weeks becoming a woman she had watched die of fever in a room with no proper air and no proper doctor, because her father hadn't wanted to spend the money. She had done it because Mr. Whitmore had looked her in the eye in the hour after Celeste drew her last breath, and told her plainly that if she refused, he would see to it she never found honest work again in the state of Virginia. A woman with no family name, no inheritance, and no one to speak for her does not have the luxury of a conscience. Amelia had learned that long before this moment. She simply had not expected it to cost her quite this much. The guests stared. She felt every single pair of eyes. Felt them the way you feel the sun on the back of your neck. Slow at first, and then suddenly, uncomfortably everywhere. A woman in the second pew leaned close to her neighbor and said something behind her gloved hand. The neighbor's eyebrows rose. Amelia did not look at them. She looked at the man standing at the front of the church. Elliot Hargrove was tall. That was the first thing she had ever been told about him, back in the days when this was still someone else's problem. Tall and quiet, and not given to easy smiling. That was how Celeste had described him in their long afternoon conversations, turning Amelia's hairbrush over in her hands the way she always did when something was bothering her. "He isn't cruel," Celeste had said. "He's just decided, like a door that's already shut and latched and doesn't see any reason to open again." She had laughed when she said it, but the laugh didn't quite reach her eyes. Amelia hadn't understood then why that made the girl sad. She understood now. Elliot Hargrove stood with his hands at his sides and his face arranged in the careful stillness of a man who had made a private peace with his own expectations. He was watching her walk toward him, and something in his expression, not quite suspicion, not quite confusion, but something quietly living in the territory between them, made Amelia's stomach go hard and cold. He already knew something was wrong. She could see it in the set of his jaw, in the way his eyes didn't move from her face. She stopped beside him. The minister began. Elliot said nothing. He looked forward, but after a moment, so small she almost missed it, he glanced down at her. Amelia kept her eyes on the minister. "Miss Whitmore," Elliot said, barely above a murmur, beneath the minister's opening words. She turned her head a fraction. "You're shorter than I expected," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a plain observation, delivered without heat or any particular expression. But it hit her the way a stone dropped into still water hits. Not loudly, but deep, and the ripples kept going long after the surface looked calm again. "Forgive me," she said. Her voice came out steady. She thanked the Lord for small mercies. "I've always been this height." He held her gaze for one beat longer. Then he looked back at the minister. The ceremony moved forward. She said the words when the minister asked for them. She heard herself speak them from a strange, hollow distance, as though she were standing slightly outside her own body, watching a woman with her face and her voice make promises she had no rightful claim to make. When the minister asked if anyone present had cause to object to this union, the silence lasted approximately 4 years by Amelia's reckoning. Then it ended. The minister pronounced them man and wife. Elliot Hargrove turned toward her and looked at her with those calm, unreadable eyes, and said nothing at all before he offered her his arm. She took it. Outside, the Virginia summer hit her like stepping into an oven. "Well done," said Mr. Whitmore, materializing at her left elbow with a smile that occupied only the lower half of his face. Celeste. The name struck her somewhere between the shoulder blades. Beside her, Elliot went very still. "Sir?" His voice was quiet, the quietness of a man who doesn't need volume to make a point. He turned to address Whitmore fully. "I'd be grateful if you'd give my wife and me a moment." Whitmore blinked. The smile widened, blander and emptier than before. Of course. Newlyweds. Completely understandable." He stepped back. "Celeste, I'll call on you next week." He walked away. Amelia stood in the summer heat with her hand resting on her new husband's arm and waited. "He called you Celeste," Elliot said. "That's my name," she said. The pause that followed was not short. "Yes," said Elliot, "it is." He didn't say anything further, but he hadn't let go of her arm, and she noticed. She was very good at noticing things. It had been a survival skill for as long as she could remember. That his grip at her elbow had tightened by a fraction. Not roughly, just with a particular deliberateness of a man reminding himself to stay measured. The ride to Hargrove Plantation took the better part of an hour through heat that shimmered off the road in visible waves. They sat across from each other in the carriage in silence. Amelia watched the countryside move past the window and concentrated on breathing at a normal rate. Elliot watched her. Not rudely, not with anger. The way a man watches something he can't quite account for yet. Patient, quiet, and entirely unwilling to look away until he's satisfied. "You don't care for carriages," he said after a while. She looked at him. "I beg your pardon?" "You've had your hand pressed flat against the seat since we left the church." He held her gaze. "The letters your father sent described a woman who was fond of travel, who found long rides restful." Amelia's throat went tight. She thought quickly. "People change," she said. "Summer heat makes it harder to settle." "It does," Elliot agreed. He let it go. But he leaned back against his seat and went on watching her with that same careful expression, and Amelia had the cold, clear understanding that this man was not going to be as manageable as Mr. Whitmore had assumed. Hargrove Plantation was large and ran deep. She had known that from Celeste's descriptions, But knowing a thing and walking into the breathing reality of it were different matters. The household staff stood in a line outside to receive them. 8 people, ranging from a weathered groundskeeper to a girl barely past 14. At the far end of the line stood a woman who looked to be in her middle 50s, iron-haired and straight-backed, with eyes like 2 chips of struck flint. "Mrs. Aldridge," Elliot said as they approached. "My wife." Mrs. Aldridge's gaze moved to Amelia and stayed there. Something happened in those flint eyes, quick and sharp and gone in an instant, like a match lit and blown out. "Ma'am," she said. Her voice was level as a plank. "Mrs. Aldridge," Amelia replied. She tried to put warmth into it. The woman's expression did not shift by a single degree. Elliot introduced the rest of the staff by name. Amelia committed each face to memory with the desperate focus of a woman who understood that, in this house, allies might be the only thing standing between her and ruin. Her room was in the east wing. "We'll dine at 7, Elliot said, pausing at her door. "If that suits you." "It does," she said. He nodded once. He didn't come in. She stood alone in the center of a room that belonged to a life she hadn't earned, and pressed both hands over her face and breathed. Once. Twice. 3 times. She was still standing there when she heard the door open. She turned fast. Mrs. Aldridge stepped in and closed the door behind her with the quiet precision of a woman who had no intention of being overheard. She folded her hands in front of her and looked at Amelia straight on. "I owe you an apology," she said. "I stared at you outside. It wasn't proper." "It was fine," Amelia said carefully. "No, it wasn't," Mrs. Aldridge paused. "I stared because I was surprised. I met Miss Celeste Whitmore once, 3 years ago, when Mr. Hargrove and her father first began their discussions." She paused again, deliberate as a judge. "You are not her." The room went very quiet. Amelia's heartbeat was so loud in her own ears, she was half convinced the woman could hear it. "I don't know what you're referring to," she said. "No," said Mrs. Aldridge, in that same even tone. "I don't expect you do." She looked at Amelia without blinking, without heat, without any expression that could be easily grabbed hold of. "Miss Whitmore had a birthmark. Here." She touched 2 fingers to the left side of her jaw, shaped like a small leaf. "I have a good memory for faces. You don't have it." The silence stretched. "Mrs. Aldridge, I'm not going to say anything," the housekeeper said. Amelia went absolutely still. "I raised Elliot Hargrove from the age of 7, Mrs. Aldridge continued quietly. "I watched his father make that boy into a man through sheer force of expectation and precious little tenderness. I know what it cost him. I know what this arrangement cost him, too. Agreeing to marry a woman he'd never laid eyes on, for the sake of business his father started and obligations that were never rightfully his." She looked at Amelia with those steady, ancient eyes, and for the first time, Amelia saw something in them that wasn't coldness. It was something far older and far sadder than coldness. "I don't know what brought you here in her place. I don't know what you've been promised or threatened with, or what you tell yourself you're doing. But I'll tell you this plainly." She stepped forward. "He is a good man. He deserves honest dealing. And if you use him ill, if you use this house ill, I will know. And I will not be silent then." She moved to the door. "Dinner is at 7, she said, and she left. Amelia stood for a long time after the door shut. Then she sat down on the edge of the bed and put her hands flat on her knees and stared at the floor, and tried to decide, very quietly and without any drama, what kind of woman she was going to be in this place. She didn't have an answer. Not yet. Dinner was formal and careful. Elliot sat at the head of the table. She sat to his right. There were more dishes than she could comfortably eat, and more silence than she knew what to do with. And she kept her posture straight, and her movements deliberate, and focused on eating with the practiced attention of a woman who had spent her whole life watching how other people did things, and teaching herself to do them the same way. "Did you find the room comfortable?" Elliot asked. "Very much so, thank you. If there's anything you need, Mrs. Aldridge will see to it. She seems very capable." "She is." He lifted his glass, set it down without drinking. "Your father's letters mentioned you were fond of gardening." Amelia thought quickly. "I enjoy it when the weather permits." "The kitchen garden runs along the south side of the house. You're welcome to it." "That's kind." "It isn't kindness," he said simply. "It's your home." The words landed in a place she hadn't expected. Your home. She'd never had one of those. Not truly. She'd had rooms in other people's houses, and corners of other people's lives, and a small wage and a future that got smaller every year. The idea that this place, any place, could be hers was so unfamiliar, she didn't quite know how to hold it without dropping it. "Elliot," she said. He looked up from his plate. It was the first time she'd used his name. She saw it register, a brief, quiet attention in his eyes, like a man who'd heard his name spoken from a direction he hadn't anticipated. "I want to do this right," she said. She hadn't planned to say it. It came out the way the truth tends to come out, when you're tired and afraid, and there's no audience left to perform for. "Whatever this is between us, I want to do it right." He looked at her for a long moment, a look that takes things in and gives nothing back in return. "So do I," he said, finally. They finished the meal. He blew out the candle himself when they rose from the table. She went upstairs. She was nearly asleep when she heard footsteps in the hallway outside her door. They stopped. She held her breath. The footsteps moved on. She lay in the dark and listened to the house settle around her, and she thought about what Mrs. Aldridge had said. "He is a good man." And she thought about Celeste laughing about a shut door and not understanding why it made her sad. And she thought about the ring on her finger that sat slightly loose because Celeste's hands had been slightly larger than hers. And she thought that she was going to have to be very, very careful, because Elliot Hargrove had been watching her all day with those quiet, patient eyes. And she had a feeling, cold and certain as January river water, that he already knew something was wrong. He just hadn't decided yet what he intended to do about it. 3 days passed. They moved through the house on separate currents, polite and measured, and never quite meeting. He rose before dawn. She rose earlier. He worked in his study through the mornings. She found the kitchen garden and worked it with the focused intensity of a woman who needed her hands occupied, or her mind would betray her. Mrs. Aldridge watched from a careful distance and kept her counsel. On the 4th morning, the letter arrived. It came with the regular post, and Amelia was in the front hall when the hall boy carried it in on a small tray. She saw the handwriting on the envelope before she saw anything else about it, because she had spent 2 years watching those particular loops and careful angles appear on correspondence that was never intended for her eyes. The letter was addressed to Mr. Elliot Hargrove. It was written in the hand of Celeste Whitmore. Amelia stood very still and stared at it, and felt the blood leave her face despite the summer heat pressing in through the open door. Celeste was 3 weeks dead. She had stood at that graveside. She had helped wash the woman's hair before they laid her out. And yet there was her handwriting, alive and deliberate, on a cream envelope, addressed to the man Amelia had just married, in her name. The hall boy was already moving toward the study. "I'll take that," Amelia said. The boy stopped, looked at her. "It's addressed to Mr. Hargrove, ma'am." "I know," she smiled. It cost her everything she had left. "I'll see it gets to him directly." He handed it over. He likely shouldn't have. But she was the mistress of this house, and mistresses of houses generally got what they asked for. She was still learning that, still startled each time it turned out to be true. She stood alone in the hall, with the letter held between her two hands. She should give it to Elliot. She knew that without question. Whatever it contained, and she could guess, because she was not a fool and had never had the luxury of being one, he had every right to read it. Mrs. Aldridge had said it plainly. He deserves honest dealing. She stared at the envelope. She heard his footsteps in the hall behind her. "Something come in?" Elliot asked. She turned around. He was looking at the letter in her hands. She made her decision in the space of a single breath. It was not the right decision. She knew that even as she made it, the way you sometimes know a thing in your bones, while your hands do the opposite. But it was the only one that kept the ground from dropping out from under her feet. "Nothing important," she said. She folded the letter and slipped it into the pocket of her dress in one smooth motion. "A note from a neighboring household. I'll deal with it." Elliot looked at her. His eyes were quiet, steady, patient as stone. "All right," he said. He walked back toward his study. She stood in the hall alone, with the letter pressed against her hip through the fabric of her dress. Warm, insistent, impossible to ignore. She put her hand flat over her pocket, and she understood, standing in the quiet of a house that wasn't hers, wearing a name she hadn't earned, holding a secret that could end everything she had not yet decided she wanted. She understood, with a clarity that left no room for argument or softening, that the bargain she had struck in that church 4 days ago had just become something else entirely. She had walked through those doors expecting to be a substitute, a placeholder, a name on a document and a face at a table. She was beginning to understand, with something very close to dread, that she was something far more dangerous than that. She was a lie that had started breathing on its own. And the man down that hall, patient, watchful, already asking questions she didn't have safe answers to, was the kind of man who did not stop until he found what he was looking for. She burned it. Not immediately. That would have been too easy, and nothing in Amelia Carter's life had ever been easy. She carried the letter folded against her hip through the rest of the morning, through the kitchen garden where she pulled weeds with more force than was strictly necessary, through a conversation with the cook about the week's provisions that she retained approximately none of, and finally into her room after the noon meal, where she sat on the edge of the bed and held it for a long time before she finally broke the seal. She told herself she had every right. She told herself she needed to know what was in it before she could decide what to do. She told herself a great many things, and none of them were quite the truth, which was simply this. She was afraid. Afraid of what Celeste Whitmore had written from the grave, and more afraid still of what Elliot Hargrove would do when he found out. The letter was short, 5 sentences. Mr. Hargrove, I am writing this in the event that I am unable to write again. My health has declined more quickly than my father is willing to admit, even to himself. If you are reading this after our wedding, then the woman beside you is not me. Her name is Amelia Carter. She is a good person who had no real choice. Please do not punish her for my father's decisions. C.W. Amelia read it 3 times. Then she sat very still and let the full weight of what she was holding settle onto her chest like a stone dropped from a great height. Celeste had known. Celeste had written this letter knowing what her father intended to do, knowing that Amelia would be sent in her place, and instead of exposing it, Instead of protecting her own name or her own dignity, she had used the last of her strength to protect the woman who would wear it. Amelia pressed the back of her hand to her mouth. She did not cry. She hadn't cried in so long she wasn't certain she still knew how. But something broke open in her chest, in the vicinity of where her conscience lived, and it hurt in a way that was entirely different from fear. She folded the letter. She carried it downstairs to the kitchen fireplace. She held it to the flame until there was nothing left but ash. Then she went back to work. She was in the garden when Mrs. Aldridge found her. The housekeeper moved with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had long ago stopped announcing herself and simply appeared where she was needed. "You had a letter this morning," Mrs. Aldridge said. Amelia didn't look up from the rose she was tending. "I dealt with it." "I'm sure you did." A pause. "The hallboy mentioned the handwriting looked like a woman's." Amelia kept her hands moving. "A neighbor's wife, welcoming me to the county." "Ah." Another pause, longer this time. "That's neighborly." "It is." Mrs. Aldridge crouched down on the other side of the row, uninvited, and picked up a trowel. She began working with the precise, unhurried movements of a woman who had been doing this particular kind of work her entire life. "Mr. Hargrove asked about it at lunch," she said conversationally. Amelia's hand stopped, just for a fraction of a second. Then she started again. "He asked about the letter?" "He asked if you seemed settled in, whether you'd received any correspondence that required his attention." Mrs. Aldridge turned a clump of earth over. "I told him I couldn't say." "That was honest of you." "I'm an honest woman." The silence between them had texture to it, the kind of silence that isn't empty, but is filled with everything neither person is quite willing to put into words yet. "Mrs. Aldridge," Amelia said quietly, "what do you want from me?" The housekeeper looked up. Those flint eyes held something complicated in them. "I want you to survive this," she said, "and I want him not to be hurt more than he's already been hurt. I'm not certain those two things are compatible." She stood, brushed the soil from her hands, and handed the trowel back. "Dinner's at 7. She walked back toward the house without another word. Amelia sat back on her heels and pressed her dirty hands flat against her thighs and stared at nothing for a long moment. Then she heard the study window open above her. "You're going to need a hat," Elliot said. She looked up. He was standing at the open window, sleeves rolled past his elbows, papers in one hand. He was looking down at her with that same expression he'd been wearing since the moment she came through the church doors. Measured, attentive, giving away nothing. "I'm fine," she said. "You'll burn." "I don't burn easily." He looked at her another moment. "Celeste," he said. She looked up. "My mother's rose beds are along the east wall. They haven't been properly tended since she died. If you're going to be in the garden regardless, I'd consider it a kindness." He closed the window before she could answer. She went to the rose beds. She didn't know why exactly, except that he'd asked in a way that wasn't quite asking, which was, she was beginning to understand, the way Elliot Hargrove communicated almost everything. And because she needed something to do with her hands that would keep her from thinking too directly about the ash in the kitchen fireplace. The roses were in a bad way. 3 seasons of neglect had tangled them into a dense, thorned mess, and she spent the better part of 2 hours working through it methodically, getting scratched, occasionally getting scratched badly enough to bleed, and talking herself out of stopping each time it happened. She was so absorbed in the work that she didn't hear the footsteps until they were directly behind her. She spun around. Elliot stood 2 feet away, holding a pair of proper garden gloves. He looked at her hands, at the scratches, at the smear of blood along her left wrist. "Lord have mercy," he said under his breath. He took hold of her wrist, not roughly, and turned it toward him. He examined it the way a man examines something that's wrong and requires correcting. "Why didn't you stop? I was almost through the worst of it. You're bleedin'." "I've bled before." He looked up from her wrist and met her eyes. This close, she could see that his were not simply brown, as she'd catalogued them from a distance. They were brown with amber in them, and right now they were carrying an expression she hadn't expected to see on his face this early. Something that looked, improbably, like concern. "Put the gloves on," he said. He let go of her wrist, stepped back. She put the gloves on. He didn't leave. He stood at the edge of the beds and watched her work, his arms crossed, and his expression returning to its customary, careful neutrality. She was aware of him the way you're aware of a fire in a room, not looking directly at it, but always knowing exactly where it is. "You know roses," he said after a while. "Some. The letters mentioned you preferred watercolors and music." She kept her hands moving. "People have more than one interest." "They do." He was quiet for a moment. "The letters mentioned a great many things." Something in his tone made her hands slow. She glanced at him. He was watching the roses, not her. His jaw was set at the particular angle she was beginning to recognize as the one he wore when he was working something through internally, peeling it back, layer by layer, with the patience of a man who understood that some answers only come if you don't push for them. "Elliot," she said. "Did you want this? The arrangement, I mean. The marriage." He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "My father and Harlan Whitmore were business partners for 15 years. When my father died, the debt between them was significant. This arrangement was how it was settled." "That's not what I asked." He looked at her then. "No," he said. "It isn't." He uncrossed his arms and put his hands in his pockets. "Does it matter? What's done is done." "It matters to me." He held her gaze. "Why?" She didn't have a safe answer to that. She looked back at the roses. "Because you're a person," she said. "Not a ledger entry." The silence that came after that one stretched long and quiet, and she couldn't read what was in it, and she didn't try. "Supper," he said, finally. "Don't stay out much longer." He walked back toward the house. She watched him go and thought about a dead woman who had spent the last of her energy writing a letter that said she is a good person who had no real choice. And she thought that Celeste Whitmore had been far kinder than the world she'd been born into deserved. She went inside when the sun started dropping. She washed her hands. She changed her dress. She went down to supper and sat across from her husband and ate and made careful conversation and gave away nothing. She was very good at that. She'd had to be. What she was not prepared for was what happened after. She was halfway up the stairs when the front door opened and Harlan Whitmore walked in. He hadn't knocked. He walked in like a man who owned the place, which he almost did, she supposed, technically, or had until 4 days ago, and handed his hat to the hall boy and looked up the staircase and saw her and smiled. "Celeste," he said, "good evening." Her grip on the banister tightened so hard her knuckles ached. "Mr. Whitmore." She kept her voice perfectly level. "We weren't expecting you." "No, I expect not." He moved toward the foot of the stairs. "I wanted to check in, make certain you were settling in comfortably. A father's prerogative." The smile didn't shift. It was the smile of a man who had never in his life felt it necessary to mean what he said. "Is Hargrove about?" "He's in his study." "Excellent." He started toward the hallway, stopped, looked back at her. "You're doing very well," he said, quietly, just for her. "Very convincing. I'm pleased." She said nothing. He went down the hall. She stood on the stairs and listened to the knock at the study door, and the door opening, and the murmur of two men's voices, beginning the kind of conversation she was not going to be invited into. And she understood. The understanding hit her like stepping off a step you didn't know was there, that whatever Whitmore wanted here tonight, it had nothing to do with checking on his daughter's comfort. She went quietly down the stairs. She moved down the hall on silent feet and stopped outside the study door, where the voices had dropped the particular register of men who believe they are not being overheard. "The Beaumont land," Whitmore was saying. "I need you to sign the transfer before the end of the month." Elliot's voice was slower, more deliberate. "We discussed this. That parcel wasn't part of the original agreement. The original agreement has evolved." "Agreements don't evolve, Harlan. They're renegotiated. Openly." "I'm renegotiating. Openly. I'm standing here, aren't I?" A pause. "You're standing in my house, uninvited, at 9 in the evening, asking me to sign over land that didn't appear in any document I agreed to. That's not negotiation." Elliot's voice was quiet. It was so quiet, it was almost pleasant. But there was something beneath the pleasantness that had no softness in it at all. "That's something else." "You have my daughter," Whitmore said. His tone shifted, smoother, more dangerous. "She is in this house. I have certain interests I need protected." "Your daughter is my wife," Elliot said, "not collateral." Another pause. Longer. "Of course," Whitmore said, easy as breathing. "I only meant—" "I know what you meant." Still that quiet, still that iron underneath it. "I'll have my solicitor review the Beaumont documents. If there's a legitimate claim, we'll discuss it properly. That's all I'm prepared to offer tonight." "Hargrove." "It's late, Harlan. I'll have someone see you out." Amelia pressed herself flat against the wall and moved back down the hall as quickly and quietly as she was able. She made the stairs and got herself up them and into her room and closed the door, and stood with her back against it, and breathed. Whitmore wasn't done. She had known that from the moment he'd looked up at her on that staircase with that empty smile. Whatever arrangement he'd made with the dead man's debts, whatever he'd constructed out of Celeste and a forged identity and a church full of witnesses, it was bigger than she'd been told. There was land in it, real land, legal documents, money enough to drive a man to use his dying daughter as a pawn and her maid as a replacement piece. She had been so focused on surviving one day at a time that she hadn't thought far enough ahead to ask what this was all actually for. She thought about it now, and it made her cold straight through, despite the summer heat pressing through the walls. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, with her hands folded in her lap, when she heard the front door close and Whitmore's carriage roll away down the drive. She heard Elliot's footsteps in the hall below. They stopped at the foot of the stairs. She held her breath. He didn't come up. After a moment, his footsteps moved back toward the study. She let out her breath. Then she did something she hadn't done since childhood, when things were very bad and she had run out of options. She clasped her hands together and bent her head and asked, silently and without particular expectation, for some guidance in a situation she had managed to make considerably worse than it started. No answer came, but she felt a little steadier for having asked. She lay down on the bed without undressing and stared at the ceiling and thought things through with the methodical, unsentimental approach she'd developed out of necessity over 26 years of having nothing but her own wits to rely on. The facts as she understood them. Whitmore had placed her here as a proxy. He wanted Elliot's cooperation on a land deal that hadn't been part of the original agreement. He intended to use Amelia's presence, Celeste's presence, as leverage. He believed Elliot wouldn't expose the deception, as long as the deception was useful to both of them. What he hadn't counted on, what she was only now beginning to understand, was Elliot. A man who called a midnight business visit what it was. A man who said, "Your daughter is my wife, not collateral," in a tone that left no room for argument. A man who had been watching her since the moment she walked down that aisle, with the quiet, patient attention of someone who was waiting to understand something he already half knew. She was going to have to tell him. The thought arrived fully formed and immediately terrifying. She turned it over, examined it from every angle, looked for the way it could be avoided. There wasn't one. Not if Whitmore was going to keep coming. Not if there were legal documents involved that carried her false name. Not if Elliot was going to keep being... She searched for the right word and landed on one that surprised her. Decent. It was harder to maintain a deception against a decent person. Every kindness made it worse. Every quiet moment of genuine exchange made the lie sit heavier. She'd learned that tonight, watching him set down his fork and look at her across the table and ask, carefully and without pressure, whether she'd enjoyed her afternoon. She had no idea how a woman told a man she'd married him under a dead woman's name, in service of a fraud she hadn't fully understood the scope of. But she was going to have to find out. She fell asleep sometime past midnight with her boots still on, and Celeste's letter reduced to ash in the kitchen grate, and the ring sitting slightly loose on her finger. And she dreamed of nothing she could hold on to when morning came. What she woke to was the sound of raised voices downstairs. She was on her feet before she was fully awake, moving on reflex, out the door and down the hallway and to the top of the stairs. She stopped there. Mrs. Aldridge stood in the entrance hall below, arms crossed, blocking the front door with her whole body. And in the doorway, red-faced and considerably less composed than he had been the previous evening, stood Harlan Whitmore. "I need to speak with my daughter," he said. "Stand aside, woman." "Mr. Hargrove isn't receiving visitors this morning," Mrs. Aldridge said, unmoved. "And neither is Mrs. Hargrove." "She isn't... I'm her father." "Yes, sir. I'll let her know you called." "Move! Aside!" Amelia started down the stairs. Whitmore saw her before she'd reached the 5th step. His expression shifted so fast it almost looked like two different men living behind the same face. The angry one slamming a door shut, while the managed one stepped forward, wearing that familiar, hollow smile. "Celeste," he said. "Good morning, sweetheart." The word hit her like a slap. She kept moving. She reached the bottom of the stairs and stood beside Mrs. Aldridge and looked at Harlan Whitmore, and thought about a letter written by a dying woman. And she thought about, "You're doing very well, very convincing." And she thought about land transfers and debts and proxy brides, and a man down the hall who hadn't asked her a single hard question yet, but was running out of reasons not to. "What do you need, Mr. Whitmore?" she said. His eyes tightened almost imperceptibly. The smile held. "I need a word with you privately, about some family matters." "Anything you need to say to me can be said here." "Celeste." "Here," she repeated. Quiet. Final. "Or not at all." He stared at her. Behind the smile, behind the managed pleasantness, something moved in his eyes. Surprise, she thought. And beneath the surprise, something colder. The kind of look a man gives a piece on a chessboard that is moved in a direction it wasn't supposed to be able to move. "All right," he said after a moment. "I need you to speak to Hargrove about the Beaumont parcel. He trusts you. A word from a wife carries weight. I need him to sign this week." She looked at him, at the man who had stood at his daughter's deathbed and seen a transaction rather than a loss. At the man who had looked at Amelia, a woman with no name and no options and no one to speak for her, and seen something equally useful. "No," she said. The smile disappeared. "I beg your pardon?" "I said no." She kept her voice perfectly even. She was distantly proud of that. "I'm not going to ask my husband to sign documents he hasn't agreed to. That's my answer." Whitmore looked at her with those pale, dry eyes, and the thing behind them wasn't surprise anymore. "You need to be very careful," he said softly, "about where you put yourself in this situation. You seem to have forgotten what I know, what I could say." "Then say it," she said. Silence. She hadn't planned it. Those 3 words came out of the same place the earlier ones had. The place past fear, past calculation, past the long years of careful self-effacement. And they landed in the air between them and didn't take them back. "Excuse me?" Whitmore said. "If you have something to say," Amelia said, "then say it, to whom you like. Say what you know." She kept her eyes on his. "And I'll say what I know." He went very still. "I know what Celeste wrote," she said quietly. "I know what she asked for. I know what you did with her last days, and I know exactly what you've done with me, and why. And I know enough about the Beaumont parcel to know it wasn't in the original agreement." She let that settle. "So, say what you need to say, and I'll say what I need to say, and we'll see who comes out better." Whitmore stared at her for a long, measured moment. Then he put his hat back on his head. "Good morning," he said, flat and cold as a January stone. He left. Mrs. Aldridge waited until the sound of his carriage had faded entirely before she turned to look at Amelia. Her expression was something Amelia had not yet seen on her face. Something that was not quite admiration and not quite alarm, but was somewhere between the two, in a territory that felt very close to respect. "Well," Mrs. Aldridge said. "Don't," Amelia said. "I wasn't going to say anything." "You were going to say something." "I was going to say," the housekeeper paused, "you'd best tell him yourself, before Whitmore does, because he will. That man doesn't walk away from a fight. He retreats and regroups." Amelia knew she was right. She'd known it the moment she said, "Say what you need to say," known that she had just moved something that couldn't be moved back. "I know," she said. "Tonight?" She thought about Elliot's quiet eyes across a dinner table. About "your daughter is not collateral." About a man reading letters sent by a dead woman and accepting, without comment, a wife who held her chin at the wrong angle and got scratched up tending roses without gloves. "Tonight," she said. She went back upstairs. She sat at the writing desk in her room and stared at a blank sheet of paper for a long time. She wasn't writing anything. She just needed something in front of her that was as blank and uncommitted as she felt. Because in a few hours, she was going to sit down across from Elliot Hargrove, and she was going to tell him the truth. The whole truth, in plain language, without softening or justification. And she had no idea, not the faintest idea in the world, what kind of man he was going to be when he heard it. She didn't get the chance to tell him at dinner. Elliot wasn't there. Mrs. Aldridge set the table for one without a word of explanation, and Amelia sat alone with her food going cold in front of her, and her carefully rehearsed speech dissolving at the edges like paper in rain. She hadn't realized until that moment how much of her courage had been borrowed from the necessity of the thing, from the forward momentum of it has to be tonight. And sitting alone at a table set for one, with no one to tell the truth to, She felt it drain out of her like water through cupped hands. "Where is he?" she finally asked, when Mrs. Aldridge came to clear the plates. "Rode out this afternoon. Business on the south property." The housekeeper didn't look at her. "He sometimes stays out past dark when he's working through something." "Working through something," Amelia repeated.
"He thinks better on horseback." A pause. "Always has." She didn't ask what he was working through. She suspected she already knew. She went to bed early and lay awake late, and when she finally slept, it was fitfully. And when she woke, it was to gray early light and the sound of a horse in the yard, and boots on the stairs, moving past her door without stopping. He was home. She let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. She gave him an hour. Then she got up and dressed and went downstairs. He was in the study. She knocked. "Come in." He was at his desk, still in his riding clothes, papers spread in front of him. He looked up when she entered. He looked tired. Not the kind of tired that comes from a bad night's sleep, but the kind that sits deeper, behind the eyes, the kind that accumulates over time. He looked like a man who had been carrying something for a long while and had recently checked its weight and found it heavier than expected. "You didn't come to dinner," she said. "I apologize. I should have sent word."
"You don't owe me an apology." She stepped further into the room. "Elliot, I need to talk to you." Something moved in his expression. Not surprise. He had, she was beginning to understand, very little room for surprise left in him. It was more like a man who had been waiting for a particular sound and had just heard it. "Sit down," he said. She sat. He set his pen down and folded his hands on the desk and looked at her with those steady, amber-brown eyes, and waited. She had practiced this. She had turned it over in her head all through the previous afternoon and evening and the long, sleepless stretch of night. She had found clean, plain language. She had decided to start at the beginning and move forward in a straight line without detour or apology until she reached the end. What she said was, "My name is Amelia Carter." The room went very quiet. Elliot didn't move. His hands stayed folded. His expression didn't shift. But she felt the quality of the silence change. Felt it the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm. In the bones, before anything visible confirms it. "I know," he said. The word hit her like a plank. "You—" She stopped. Started again. "You know." "I've known since the church." His voice was even, measured. "You held your bouquet with your left hand." Celeste Whitmore was right-handed. Her father mentioned it in his letters, that she had a particular habit of writing with her right hand pressed so hard into the page she left impressions on the sheet below. He looked at her steadily. "You favored your left throughout the ceremony. I noticed." Amelia stared at him. "The birthmark," she said, faintly. "Mrs. Aldridge told you about it." "She did." "She told me 3 days ago that you didn't have it." He paused, though I'd already accounted for that myself. The ground had shifted in a way she could feel in her feet. She had come into this room prepared to confess. She had not come prepared for this. For the quiet, devastatingly calm revelation that the man she'd been lying to had known the truth longer than she'd been telling it. "Why didn't you say anything?" she asked. "Because I wanted to understand what I was dealing with before I responded to it." He unfolded his hands and sat back in his chair. "That's how I work through things. I don't react until I know what I'm reacting to." "You wrote out yesterday." "I needed to think." "About what to do with me." He looked at her directly. "About what Harlan Whitmore has done," he said. "And what he intends to do next. And what my options are." He paused. "And yes, about you." She clasped her hands in her lap to keep them still. "Whitmore came back this morning, before you were up." She made herself say the rest of it plainly. "He wants me to persuade you to sign the Beaumont transfer." I told him no. He threatened me. I told him to say what he needed to say, and so did I. She held his gaze. I may have made things worse. For the first time since she'd come into the room, something crossed Elliot's face that wasn't purely controlled. It wasn't anger. It was something adjacent to anger, harder and colder, like the ground underneath anger. "He threatened you." "He reminded me of my position." "He threatened you," Elliot said again. It wasn't a question this time. It was a statement that closed around something and held it. "I'm not fragile," she said. "That's plainly evident." He stood. He moved to the window and put one hand flat on the frame and stood looking out with his back to her. And she watched the line of his shoulders and tried to read what was happening in them. "What do you know about the Beaumont land?" "Only what I heard through the study door." She didn't apologize for the eavesdropping. She suspected he wouldn't expect her to. That it wasn't in the original agreement. That Whitmore wants it transferred before the end of the month. That you refused. "The Beaumont parcel borders my south property. If Whitmore gets the transfer, he effectively controls the water access for 2/3 of my farming land." He turned back around. It wasn't in the agreement because it was never supposed to be in any agreement. He's been moving toward it for 2 years. The marriage was the final piece. He needed a legal connection to this household before he could apply enough pressure to make it work. "He used Celeste," Amelia said. "He used everyone available to him." Elliot looked at her steadily. "He used you." She looked down at her hands. The ring sat loose on her finger, the way it always did. "Celeste wrote you a letter," she said, "before she died. She warned you." She made herself look up. "I burned it." Nothing in his expression. "I know," he said. She blinked. "You—" "The hall boy told me you took a letter from the tray. I had a reasonable idea of what it contained." Celeste was a practical person, from what her letter suggested. It would have been in her nature to leave a warning. "You're not angry?" "I'm angry," he said quietly. "Not at you." The distinction landed somewhere unexpected. She sat with it for a moment. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "About Whitmore." He came back to the desk and sat down. "I've already sent for my solicitor. There are documents I should have looked at more carefully before this arrangement was finalized. I was operating on trust I shouldn't have extended." He picked up his pen, set it down again. "About you," he looked at her. "That's a more complicated question." "You could send me back," she said. She said it clearly, without flinching, because she'd decided, somewhere in the middle of the sleepless night, that she was done flinching. "You have grounds, more than enough. You could expose the fraud, dissolve the arrangement, and send me back to whatever Whitmore decides to do with me. Legally, that's your cleanest option." "It is," he said. "Is that what you're going to do?" He looked at her for a long time. The morning light was coming through the window behind him, and in that light he looked less managed than usual, less arranged. He looked like a man in the middle of an honest decision, which was, she was starting to understand, a place he went to only rarely and entirely alone. "No," he said. One word. She felt it move through her chest like a struck bell. "Why not?" she asked. "Because Whitmore wins if I do." He picked up the pen again. "And because Mrs. Aldridge told me what happened in the garden yesterday. With the roses." He paused. "And because you stood in my front hall this morning and told a man twice your weight and 10 times your social power to say what he needed to say." He looked up. "And because Celeste apparently trusted you enough to write you a warning instead of a condemnation. Amelia's throat tightened. "I don't know how to thank you for that," she said. "Don't thank me yet. This is not a comfortable situation." He leaned forward. "If we proceed as we are, if you remain here as my wife, in fact, as well as name, there will be complications. Whitmore will not stop. He'll find another approach. And the longer this goes on, the more people will know or suspect the truth, and the harder it becomes to manage." "I know. You'll need to be very careful." "I've been careful my whole life." "This is a different kind of careful." His voice was not unkind. It was the voice of a man being honest about hard things, which she was beginning to understand was the only voice he had. People in this county knew Celeste, some of them well enough to notice discrepancies. Her father will eventually decide that exposure serves him better than cooperation, and if that happens, "Then I'll face it," she said. He looked at her. "I'm not asking you to protect me from consequences," she said. I'm not even asking. I have no right to ask." She stopped, steadied herself. "I want to earn my place here, honestly, whatever that requires." The silence that followed was long and careful and full of something she couldn't quite name. "All right," he said. He went back to his papers. She understood somehow that the conversation was over. Not ended badly, simply finished, the way a piece of work is finished when everything necessary has been done. She stood. She was at the door when he said, quietly, "Amelia." She turned. He was still looking at his papers. "The roses," he said. "My mother planted them the year she was married. She said they needed someone stubborn enough to tend them properly." He turned a page. "I'm glad they have someone stubborn enough now." She left without answering because she didn't trust her voice. She was in the garden. She was always in the garden when her mind needed somewhere to put itself. When Mrs. Aldridge appeared with 2 cups of tea and the expression of a woman who already knew what had happened and had simply been waiting for confirmation. "He knew," Amelia said. "He did." Mrs. Aldridge handed her a cup. "Since before the wedding, I expect." "Since the church." The housekeeper made a small sound that might have been satisfaction. "That's Elliot." They drank tea in a silence that was, for the first time since Amelia had arrived at this house, not uncomfortable. It was just quiet. The good kind of quiet. The kind that doesn't need anything from you. It lasted exactly as long as it took for the sound of fast-moving horses to reach them from the road. Mrs. Aldridge heard it first. Her cup stopped halfway to her mouth, and she turned her head toward the drive with the sharp attention of a woman who had lived long enough to know that fast horses in the middle of the morning rarely meant good news. 3 riders came through the gate. Amelia recognized the one in the middle before she could clearly see his face, the set of the shoulders, the way he rode like a man who believed the road owed him passage. Harlan Whitmore. And on either side of him, men she didn't recognize, both of them in the kind of clothes that suggested professional employment of a legal variety. Her cup came down. "Inside," said Mrs. Aldridge, quietly. "No." Amelia set her cup on the garden wall and straightened her back. "No, I'm done going inside." The housekeeper looked at her. Then she set her own cup down and folded her hands in front of her. The 3 men dismounted at the front of the house. Whitmore didn't come to the garden. He went straight to the front door and knocked with the particular confidence of a man who believes he has already won the next conversation. Amelia walked around the side of the house to the front. Elliot had opened the door himself. He stood in it with his arms at his sides and his expression arranged in that careful, iron-underneath pleasantness that she had come to read as his version of a raised guard. He looked at the 2 strangers. He looked at Whitmore. "Harlan," he said. "Elliot,
Whitmore's voice was smooth and easy. The voice he used when he decided he held the better cards. "I've brought Mr. Dalton and Mr. Cruz. They're with the county court. I've asked them here as witnesses to a matter of some legal delicacy." He looked past Elliot's shoulder and saw Amelia coming around the corner of the house, and his eyes tightened. "I think you know what matter I'm referring to." Elliot didn't look at Amelia. He kept his eyes on Whitmore. "Come in," he said. They all went inside. Amelia followed. No one told her not to. They stood in the entrance hall, Whitmore and his 2 court witnesses, Elliot still holding the door frame with one hand, Mrs. Aldridge appearing from the kitchen passage like a gray-haired ghost and positioning herself near the stairs without being asked. The hall felt smaller than it had 4 days ago. "I'll say it simply," Whitmore began. "Please do," said Elliot. "The woman in this house is not Celeste Whitmore." He turned to the 2 men beside him. "She is Amelia Carter, a maidservant formerly employed in my household. The marriage conducted 4 days ago was conducted under a false identity." He looked at Elliot. "I'm prepared to have it annulled, immediately, on grounds of fraud." The 2 courtmen exchanged a glance. Amelia felt the moment land in the room like a stone through glass, the shattering happening slowly, each fracture spreading from the point of impact in its own time. She looked at Elliot. He had not moved. He had not changed expression. He was looking at Whitmore with the same steady, giving nothing away attention he brought to everything, and she could not read him, and she didn't know what he was going to say. And despite everything he had said in the study an hour ago, despite "no, and Whitmore wins if I do," she felt the cold drop of genuine fear move through her chest. "Mr. Dalton," Elliot said. His voice was perfectly calm. "Mr. Cruz, thank you for coming." He stepped back from the door. "I'd like to offer you both some refreshment before we discuss any legal matter. Mrs. Aldridge, could you see to that?" Mrs. Aldridge, without a word, moved toward the kitchen. Whitmore frowned. "There's no need for—" "Harlan." Elliot turned to look at him, full on, direct. "You have made a serious claim in front of 2 officers of the county court, in my home, without prior notice or discussion. I'm going to ask you to extend me the courtesy of handling this at the pace I choose. Is that clear?" Whitmore's jaw tightened. "Clear," he said. "Good." Elliot looked at the 2 men. "Gentlemen, if you'll wait in the parlor." He turned to Amelia. "Amelia, my study." She followed him. He closed the door. He went to his desk and opened the top drawer and removed a folded document and held it out to her. She took it, unfolded it. It was a letter. In his handwriting, not a draft but a finished document dated yesterday, addressed to the county court. She read the first lines and stopped. "I write to formally attest that I entered the marriage contracted between myself and the Whitmore family with full knowledge of the relevant circumstances. I further attest that I recognize and accept Amelia Carter as my legal wife in every respect, and that any claim of fraud in the arrangement is to be directed at the originating party, namely Harlan Whitmore, who schemed to substitute—" She stopped reading. She looked up at him. "You wrote this yesterday," she said, "when I rode out." He looked back at her without apology, without theater, without any of the things a lesser man would have wrapped around a moment this significant. "I had my solicitor meet me on the South Road. He witnessed it." "You knew I was going to come to you this morning." "I thought it was likely." "But you wrote it before I did." She looked at the document in her hands. "Before you knew what I would say." "I knew enough." He took the letter back from her. "This isn't charity. I want you to understand that clearly. If Whitmore gets the Beaumont land, he effectively controls the water rights for a property that has been in this family for 40 years.
You living in this house as my wife is the single most effective legal obstacle to that outcome." He set the letter on the desk. "I'm a practical man. I'm telling you plainly what this is." She looked at him. He looked back, steady and honest, and giving her the full truth without softening it. Because that was who he was, she understood now. A man who would not pretty up a hard thing, even when it might serve him to do so. "All right," she said. "And what am I supposed to do?" "Walk back out into that hall," he said, "and be exactly who you have been for the last 4 days. Which, for what it's worth," he paused, "has been sufficient." Coming from him, she understood, that was not a small thing. She walked out into the hall. Whitmore was standing near the parlor door, watching for her. His eyes moved from her face to Elliot behind her and back. He was calculating, she could see it, running numbers, looking for the angle. "Harlan," Elliot said. He held up the letter. "I'd like Mr. Dalton and Mr. Cruz to read something before any further claims are made." Whitmore went still. The two courtmen came out of the parlor. Elliot handed the document to Mr. Dalton, who read it in silence, passed it to Mr. Cruz, who read it with his eyebrows climbing steadily higher. Mr. Dalton looked up. "Mr. Hargrove, this is a sworn attestation." "It is, witnessed and dated." Mr. Dalton looked at Whitmore. "Sir, if Mr. Hargrove has attested to full knowledge of the arrangement, there's no fraud claim that stands against this household." He folded the letter with the careful precision of a man who wanted no part of the particular mess he had just stepped into. The claim, if any, would need to be directed at other parties. Whitmore's face had gone a color Amelia didn't have a name for. Not red. Something darker. The color of a man watching every piece move wrong on a board he thought he controlled. "This isn't over," he said. His voice was very quiet. The dangerous kind of quiet. Not Elliot's kind, which was controlled and cold, but the kind that has lost its shape and is just barely holding. "No," Elliot agreed, "it isn't, because we still have the matter of the Beaumont parcel. And now that we have two gentlemen from the county court conveniently present, I'd like to make a counterfiling regarding the original debt agreement between my father and yours." He looked at Whitmore with those amber-brown eyes that gave away nothing and gave nothing back. "I've had my solicitor review the documentation. There are some irregularities I'd like addressed formally. Shall we sit down?" Whitmore looked at Amelia, not at Elliot, at her. And the look was not anger, and not the managed pleasantness, and not even the cold threat he'd offered her in the front hall that morning. It was something else, something that recognized, she thought, that the piece he'd placed on this board had moved entirely off the square he'd put it on, and had no intention of moving back. She looked back at him and said nothing. He sat down. The meeting lasted 2 hours. Amelia remained in the hall for most of it. Mrs. Aldridge brought her tea she didn't drink and sat beside her and said nothing, which was exactly what she needed. From behind the closed study door, she could hear the low, deliberate rhythm of Elliot's voice moving through documents and dates and counterclaims, with the steady, unhurried focus of a man who had prepared for exactly this conversation and was not going to be rushed through a single line of it. When it was over, Whitmore left without looking at her. The two courtmen left with careful expressions and armfuls of documentation. Elliot came out of the study and stood in the hall and looked at her and said, "The solicitor will be here Thursday. There's more to be done." "I understand," she said. He nodded once. He started back toward the study. "Elliot." He stopped. She looked at him, at this man she had married under false pretenses, who had known the truth since the church and had gone out on horseback and written a sworn attestation and walked back through his own front door, ready to fight a war she hadn't even fully understood she was in the middle of. "Why?" she asked. Not about the land. He'd explained the land. Something under the land. Something she needed to hear him say. He looked at her for a long moment. "Celeste wrote that you were a good person who had no real choice," he said. "I believe that was true." He paused. "I also believe that given a choice, you might be something more than that." He went back into the study. She stood in the hall alone with that sentence, and held it the way you hold something fragile. Carefully, with both hands, afraid to look at it too directly in case it turns out to be less solid than it feels. Something more than that. She pressed her back against the wall and looked at the ceiling and breathed, slowly, until the tightness in her chest loosened enough to move. Then she went back to the roses. She had nearly finished the worst of the tangle in the east bed when she heard the kitchen door and Mrs. Aldridge's voice carrying across the yard, speaking to someone she couldn't see. The voice that answered was a man's, unfamiliar, low, with an edge in it that made Amelia straighten up without quite knowing why. She moved around the corner of the house. A boy, young man really, 17 or 18, stood in the kitchen yard with a folded note in his hand, refusing to give it to Mrs. Aldridge. He was looking past the housekeeper, with the particular fixed attention of someone who has been told exactly who to deliver something to and intends to follow instructions to the letter. He saw Amelia. "Ma'am," he said, "this is for you, specifically." He held the note out. "I was told to put it in your hands and no one else's." She took it. She opened it. 3 words. No signature. "I know everything." She looked up. The boy was already gone. Mrs. Aldridge was watching her with those flint eyes. "What does it say?" Amelia folded the note. She looked down the empty road where the boy had gone and thought about Whitmore's face when he left. Not angry, not defeated, but recalculating. Retreating and regrouping, Mrs. Aldridge had said. "It says," Amelia said quietly, "that we're not done yet." She showed Elliot the note that evening. She didn't deliberate over it the way she might have a week ago, weighing whether to tell him, calculating the cost, managing the information like a resource to be rationed. She walked into the study, set the folded paper on the desk in front of him, and stood back and waited. He read it. He read it again. He set it down and looked at it for a moment the way he looked at most things, with that patient, give-nothing-back attention. And then he looked up at her. "Who brought it?" he asked. "A boy. Young man. I didn't recognize him." "Description?" She gave it. He nodded once, slowly, like a man filing something away. "Whitmore didn't write this himself," he said. "I know. His handwriting has a particular slant. This doesn't." Elliot looked at her. Not with surprise. She was learning that surprise was a luxury he rarely permitted himself, but with a specific quality of attention he brought to things that had just become more interesting than he'd anticipated. "You know his handwriting. I handled his correspondence for 2 years. She kept her voice even. He dictated. I wrote. Occasionally, I drafted on his behalf when he was occupied. She paused. I know exactly how he phrases a threat. That note is not his phrasing." Elliot was quiet for a moment. Someone else is involved. Someone who knows, or thinks they know. She crossed her arms, not defensively. She'd stopped doing things defensively around him sometime in the last 48 hours without quite noticing. More the way a person crosses their arms when they're cold and thinking hard. Whitmore wouldn't share what he knows unless he needed leverage he couldn't supply himself, which means whoever sent that note has something he wants. Or something he fears. The distinction sat between them. How many people knew Celeste well enough to identify a substitution? Elliot asked. In this county? I don't know. In her father's household? She thought about it carefully. The head housekeeper, two of the longer-serving maids, Celeste's personal physician. She paused. And a woman named Margaret Hale. She was Celeste's closest friend from childhood. They wrote to each other every week, without fail. Elliot's expression shifted, not dramatically, just the faintest tightening around the eyes. Margaret Hale. Her family owns the property to the east. Adjacent to yours? Adjacent to the Beaumont parcel. He stood. He moved to the window with his hands behind his back, and she watched him the way she always watched him when he was thinking something through. Quietly, from a careful distance, trying to read the shape of what he was working out without intruding on the process. If Whitmore has approached Margaret Hale, then he's offering her something in exchange for what she knows, Amelia finished it. Or threatening her with something she wants kept quiet. Margaret Hale has been trying to purchase a strip of land along the Eastern Creek boundary for 3 years. It would give her family water access independent of any neighboring agreement. He turned around. Whitmore controls that strip, has controlled it since my father's debt came due. Amelia looked at him. He's offering her the land in exchange for testimony. It's what I would do, in his position. No, she said, it isn't. He looked at her. You wouldn't do that, she said, not as a compliment, as a plain statement of observed fact. You'd find another way. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he went back to his desk and picked up the note and folded it again, and put it in the desk drawer and locked it. I need to speak with Margaret Hale before Whitmore consolidates that arrangement. He looked at her. I'd like you to come with me. She hadn't expected that. Why? Because she knew Celeste, and because if she's already made up her mind about you, I'd rather she make it up face to face than based on whatever Whitmore has told her. He held her gaze steadily. She's a fair-minded woman. Or she was. I'd like to believe she still is. Amelia thought about a note delivered by a boy who disappeared before she could ask a single question. She thought about 3 words with no signature. She thought about a woman who had written to her best friend every week without fail, and was now, apparently, in conversation with that friend's father about the best way to use her death. All right, she said. They rode out the next morning before the heat settled in. Elliot rode, and she rode beside him, and the Virginia summer was already pressing itself onto the day with that particular insistence it had in July, the kind that makes everything feel slightly urgent, like the air itself is running out of patience. They didn't speak much. They had, she was finding, a comfortable wordlessness between them that hadn't been there at the beginning, that had grown up slowly out of shared meals and adjacent silences, and the specific intimacy of 2 people who have told each other hard truths and survived the telling. At some point along the road, without discussion, he slowed his horse until they were exactly side by side. She noticed. She didn't remark on it. The Hell property was a working farm, smaller than Hargrove, older, with the lived-in look of a place that had weathered several generations of practical people making do with what they had. A woman was standing in the yard when they rode in, and she didn't look like she was surprised to see them. Margaret Hale was perhaps 30, with a direct gaze and the kind of stillness that comes not from tranquility, but from discipline. A woman who had learned to hold herself very still when she needed to think. She looked at Elliot. She looked at Amelia. Her expression did not change. "Mr. Hargrove," she said, "I wondered when you'd come." "Margaret," he dismounted, "this is—" "I know who she is." Margaret Hale's eyes stayed on Amelia. Not cruel, not warm, measuring. "You look nothing like her." "No," Amelia said. "I don't." Celeste was taller. She had her mother's coloring. The woman tilted her head. She also had the worst laugh you ever heard in your life, like a cartwheel over gravel. I told her so every week for 20 years, and she thought it was the funniest thing imaginable. Her voice didn't waver, but something behind it moved. The deep, private grief of a person who has lost something that cannot be replaced or reasoned about. She'd have found this whole situation hilarious, I expect. Amelia felt something shift in her chest. "I think she would have too," she said quietly. Margaret looked at her sharply. "You knew her?" "I worked in her father's house for 2 years. She was—" She searched for the word. "She was the only person in that house who ever asked me a question she actually wanted the answer to." The silence that followed was different from the silence before it. It had something alive in it. "Come inside," Margaret said. They sat in the kitchen, the good kind of kitchen, the kind that smells like it has fed people for 100 years. And Margaret Hale poured coffee without asking whether they wanted it, and set it in front of them, and sat down with her own cup, and looked at them both. "Whitmore came to me 6 days ago," she said. "The day after the wedding." Elliot's hands were flat on the table. "What did he offer you?" "The creek strip." She said it without embarrassment. "He knew I'd been trying to buy it for 3 years. He knew exactly what it was worth to me." She looked at her coffee cup. "He said all I needed to do was make a formal statement to the county court, that the woman in your house was not Celeste." "And?" Elliot said. She looked up. "I told him I needed time to think about it." "But you sent the note instead," Amelia said. Margaret turned to look at her. "I sent the note," she confirmed, "because I needed to know if you knew what you were doing. If you'd walked into this with your eyes open, or if he'd dragged you into it the same way he drags everyone into everything." She paused. "You came here. That tells me something." "What does it tell you?" Amelia asked. "That you're not running." Margaret set her cup down. Celeste would have liked that. She looked between the two of them. "What do you need from me?" Elliot leaned forward. "The truth about what Whitmore told you. All of it. Not the offer, the rest. What he said about the Beaumont parcel. What he said about the original debt agreement between our fathers." He held her gaze. "I believe he's been misrepresenting that agreement for some time. I need to know what version he presented to you." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Amelia began to count her own heartbeats. Then Margaret got up and went to the sideboard and opened a drawer and came back with a folded document and set it in front of Elliot. "He left me a copy of what he claims is the original agreement," she said, "so I could see the legitimacy of his position. He was very proud of it." Elliot unfolded it. He read it. Something in his face went very still in a way Amelia had not seen before. Not the usual controlled stillness, but the stillness of a man who has just seen something that confirms a thing he feared was true. "This isn't the agreement," he said. His voice was quiet, dangerously quiet. "2 clauses have been altered. The Beaumont parcel wasn't included in the original document. And the repayment terms—" He stopped. "He's falsified the repayment terms. Under this version, my father's estate would have defaulted 3 years before he died, which would mean every arrangement made since then, including the marriage contract, would be built on a legal fiction." The kitchen went very still. "Which means," Amelia said slowly, working it through, "that Whitmore doesn't actually have the legal standing he's claimed from the beginning." "It means the debt was settled," Elliot said. "Years ago. My father paid it." and Whitmore has been operating on a falsified document ever since." Margaret Hale sat down. "I didn't know," she said. "I swear to God I didn't know what I was holding." "I believe you." Elliot folded the document carefully. "Margaret, I need this. And I need you to be willing to testify to when and how Whitmore gave it to you." She looked at him for a long, hard moment. "And the creek strip?" "I'll deed it to you myself, properly, through the county court, in writing, before the end of the month." He didn't hesitate. It was never Whitmore's to offer. "It came to him through a fraudulent claim on my father's estate, which means it was mine to begin with." Margaret Hale looked at the document in his hands. She looked at Amelia. She looked at the tabletop for a long moment, with the expression of a woman running every piece of this through a mind that was careful and thorough and not given to quick decisions. "All right," she said. "I'll testify." On the ride back, Elliot didn't speak for the first mile. Amelia rode beside him and let the silence be what it was, and watched the road, and thought about falsified documents, and dead women, and 30-year debts, and the particular kind of cruelty that operates through paperwork and patience rather than violence. "He's been planning this since before your father died," she said. "Since before," Elliot confirmed. "The marriage arrangement, the Beaumont transfer, the falsified debt record. It was all one plan. The marriage was the last piece. He needed someone in my household he could control." He paused. "He chose wrong." She glanced at him. He was looking at the road. "He thought he was placing an instrument," he said. "Someone frightened enough and isolated enough to move where he needed her moved." He paused again. "He didn't account for you being you." She didn't know what to say to that. She looked back at the road and let it sit. "I owe you an honest accounting," he said abruptly. She turned. "I beg your pardon?" "I've told you why keeping you here served my legal interests." He kept his eyes forward. "That was true. It's still true. But it wasn't the whole of it." He paused, and she could see the effort the words cost him. Not because they were difficult words, but because Elliot Hargrove was a man who had learned early that saying the true thing left you exposed in ways that couldn't be managed. "You asked me in the study why I wrote that attestation before you came to me, before I knew what you'd say. You said you knew enough. I did." He looked at her then, direct and plain, and without any of the careful management she'd come to expect. "I knew because every day since you arrived in this house, you have done the right thing in a situation that offered you every reason not to. You burned a letter that would have protected you. You told Whitmore to say what he needed to say when staying quiet would have been safer. You came into my study and told me the truth when I would never have compelled you to." He held her gaze. "That is not an instrument. That is a person who has decided who she is, regardless of what she was handed to work with." She had ridden through Virginia's summer heat for 6 days and stood in front of Harlan Whitmore and not flinched, and handled more sustained fear in a single week than most people managed in a year. And none of it had put a crack in what she'd decided to be. But that sentence, delivered plainly, without theater, by a man who chose his words the way other men chose their ground, put a crack in something. She looked at the road. She breathed. She got herself back. "Elliot," she said, "what happens now? After the solicitor? After the court?" "Whitmore will be formally charged with document fraud. The falsified debt record alone is enough. The rest, the proxy marriage, the Beaumont scheme, will follow." He paused. "It will be in the papers. There will be people who know what you are and where you came from and will have opinions about it." "I know." "It won't be comfortable." "Mr. Hargrove," She used his name deliberately. I have never been comfortable in my life. I don't expect to start now. He looked at her. Something moved across his face, not quite a smile, but in the same county as one. Amelia, he said. You can call me Elliot. I know I can, she said. I have been. And this time, the corner of his mouth did move. The solicitor arrived Thursday, as promised. He was a small, precise man named Fletcher, who looked at documents with the focused absorption of someone who loved them. And he spent 4 hours in the study with Elliot and the falsified record, and Margaret Hale's sworn statement, and an expression of escalating, professionally suppressed outrage. Amelia stayed out of the study. Mrs. Aldridge brought her tea in the garden and stayed to drink her own, and they sat in the heat of the Virginia summer and listened to the muffled sound of men in a room deciding things. "How are you?" Mrs. Aldridge asked. Not in the vague, polite way people ask it. In the direct, expecting an honest answer way, she asked everything. "I don't know yet," Amelia said. "Ask me again in a week." "Fair enough." The housekeeper drank her tea. "He hasn't slept properly since you arrived, you know." Amelia looked at her. "He's up before dawn every morning. Goes to his study. I can see the light under the door when I come down." She said it without inflection, without implication, just the plain information of a woman who notices things and has decided this particular thing is worth saying. He was sleeping fine before. "Mrs. Aldridge, I'm not saying it's a bad thing." She looked at her cup. "I'm saying he's thinking about things he hasn't thought about in a long time." She paused. "That's not nothing." Amelia said nothing. She looked at the roses. They were coming along well, still ragged in places, still with thorned branches she hadn't gotten to yet, but the basic shape of them was returning. She could see what they'd been. She could see what they'd be. The study door opened at late afternoon. Fletcher emerged with his case under his arm and the look of a man who has done satisfying work and knows it. He shook Amelia's hand when Elliot introduced her, firmly, without awkwardness, with the matter-of-fact acceptance of a man who deals in facts and has been given all of them. After he left, Elliot stood in the hall and looked at her. "It'll go to the court Monday," he said. "Fletcher is filing first thing." "And Whitmore?" "He'll be notified formally. He'll have the option of settling the fraud claim privately, which he won't take, because he's the kind of man who'd rather fight a losing battle than admit he lost." He paused. "It'll be a few weeks before it's resolved." She nodded. "And between now and then?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Between now and then, you live here," he said, "as my wife, because that's what you are." He said it the way he said most things, plainly, without ornament. But there was something in it that was different from the legal argument he'd made in the study 5 days ago. It wasn't the land. It wasn't the court. It was something quieter than that. Something that had been growing in the space between two people who kept telling each other the truth, even when it was expensive. She looked at him. "Elliot. You are a profoundly difficult man to do anything dishonest around." He considered this. "Good," he said. She laughed. It came out before she decided to let it. Sudden and unguarded and real. The kind of laugh that happens to you, rather than the kind you produce. She covered her mouth almost immediately, but it was too late. He was watching her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Open in some small way, like a window raised an inch. "There," he said quietly. "That's the first honest thing you've done since you arrived." "Everything I've done since I arrived has been honest," she objected. "That," he said, "was the first one you didn't choose." He looked at her a moment longer.
It suits you." He went back to his study. She stood in the hall and pressed her hands to her face and breathed, and the ring on her finger didn't feel quite as loose as it had a week ago. And the house didn't feel quite as much like a place she'd walked into by accident. The formal charges against Harlan Whitmore were filed on Monday. By Tuesday morning, the county knew. By Wednesday, 3 women from neighboring properties had come to call on Amelia, not out of spite or curiosity, but with the instinct of people who live in the same community and have understood, collectively and without discussion, which side of a thing they want to be on. Amelia received them in the parlor. She poured tea. She was measured and warm and honest about what she was willing to say and clear about what she wasn't. And they left 2 hours later with a look of women who had come expecting one thing and found another. Mrs. Aldridge, who had been listening from the kitchen passage the entire time, appeared in the doorway when they were gone.
"Well," she said. "Don't," Amelia said. "I was going to say you handled that well." "I know what you were going to say." Mrs. Aldridge almost smiled. It was the closest Amelia had seen her come. "He'll be in for supper tonight," she said. "I thought I'd make something proper." They had supper together, the way they did every night, at the long table, in the good summer evening light, with the conversation moving between them in the easy, unhurried way of people who have stopped performing for each other. He told her about the South property. She told him about the women who had called. He listened the way he always listened, fully, without interruption, with the quality of attention that made you feel that what you were saying was worth the air it occupied. At some point, she looked up from her plate and found him looking at her. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "I was thinking." "About what?" He picked up his glass, set it down. "That I thought this arrangement was going to be the worst decision I'd ever made," he said. "And I'm beginning to think I was wrong about that." She held his gaze. "Beginning to," she repeated. The corner of his mouth moved. "Give me time." "You'll have it," she said, and meant it. Harlan Whitmore settled the fraud claim on a Thursday, 3 weeks later, under terms that left him the Whitmore house and a reduced income and very little else. The Beaumont parcel stayed with Elliot. The creek strip was formally deeded to Margaret Hale before the ink was dry on anything else. Fletcher handled it all with the quiet precision of a man who had been waiting for exactly this kind of work. Amelia was in the rose garden when Mrs. Aldridge brought her the news. She read the letter. She folded it. She pressed it flat between her palms and looked at the east bed, at the roses coming back, tangled still in places, but finding their way through, putting out new growth in the direction of the light, the way growing things do when they've been given enough room and someone stubborn enough to tend them. She heard the front door, his footsteps crossing the hall. Then, after a moment, the sound of boots on the garden path. Elliot stopped beside her. He didn't say anything. She handed him the letter. He read it. He handed it back. He stood beside her and looked at the roses, and the Virginia summer moved around them, hot and heavy and indifferent, the way summers are. "It's done," she said. "It's done," he said. She put the letter in her pocket. She reached up and touched one of the new canes, pale green, soft, still finding its shape. "Your mother knew what she was doing," she said, "planting these." "She was stubborn about them," he said. "She said anything worth growing requires someone willing to bleed for it occasionally." Amelia looked at the small scar along her left palm from the first day she'd worked the bed without gloves. She looked at the ring on her finger, which had been quietly and unobtrusively taken in by the local seamstress 2 weeks ago, and now sat exactly as it should. "She was right," she said. Elliot looked at her, and then he did something he had not done in all the weeks she had known him. Something unplanned, unmanaged, operating entirely outside the careful architecture of his usual restraint. He reached over and put his hand over hers, where it rested on the rose cane. Just that. Just his hand over her hand, warm and certain, and entirely without the performance of a gesture. She didn't pull away.
She turned her hand over and let their fingers settle together, and they stood like that in the summer garden, with the roses coming back around them, and the whole of the county settled, and the lie she had walked in wearing, finally, fully, irrevocably, replaced by the only thing that had ever been worth wearing in the first place, her own true name, in her own true life, beside a man who had seen the truth of her before she'd found the courage to say it aloud, and had chosen her anyway. Amelia Carter had walked into Hargrove Plantation as a ghost, wearing a dead woman's name. She left that garden as herself, fully, permanently, and without apology. And that was the only ending this story was ever going to have. The county did not settle quietly. Amelia had understood, in an abstract way, that the formal charges against Whitmore would generate talk. She had not fully understood what talk looked like in a Virginia county in the summer of 1816, the way it moved through church steps and market days and front parlor calls like water through limestone, finding every crack, wearing everything smooth, or wearing it away entirely, depending on what it was made of. She found out on a Sunday. The church was full, the way it had been the morning she walked down that aisle, wearing a dead woman's name and a ring 2 sizes too large. She sat beside Elliot in the Hargrove pew and kept her chin level and her hands still in her lap, and she felt the weight of every pair of eyes in that room settle onto her shoulders with the specific, collective pressure of people who have made up their minds to render a verdict. The minister preached. She heard approximately none of it. She was too occupied with the peripheral awareness of whispers. Not loud, never loud, just the particular quality of sound that human voices make when they are trying not to be heard, and failing. Beside her, Elliot sat with his hands on his knees and his jaw set and his eyes forward. He had not spoken since they'd entered the church. She could feel the tension in him. Not anger, not embarrassment, but something more like readiness. A man braced for a specific kind of difficulty. After the service, in the yard, it came. A woman named Mrs. Carver, stout, influential, with the social authority that comes from being the longest established family in the county, planted herself directly in their path with the confidence of someone who had never once in her life been required to go around an obstacle. "Mr. Hargrove," she said. Her eyes moved to Amelia, stayed there. "I think the county is owed an explanation." "Good morning, Mrs. Carver," Elliot said. "The charges against Harlan Whitmore are very serious. Document fraud. A falsified marriage." She kept looking at Amelia. "People are asking what exactly this woman's position in your household is. Legally. Morally." "Her position," Elliot said, "is my wife. She came here under a false name. She came here under circumstances manufactured by Harlan Whitmore, which the county court has already begun to address." His voice was exactly the same temperature it always was. Quiet, measured, with the iron underneath. "My marriage to Amelia Carter is legal, documented, and witnessed by 2 officers of the county court. If you have questions about the legal particulars, I'd direct you to Fletcher in town. He handled the filings." Mrs. Carver's mouth tightened. "The moral particulars?" "Mrs. Carver." Elliot took a single step forward. Not aggressive, precise. "My wife has conducted herself with more integrity in the last month than Harlan Whitmore has managed in 20 years of business in this county. She will be treated accordingly." He held the woman's gaze without blinking. "I'd appreciate your support in establishing that standard. I believe the county would follow your lead on it."
It was, Amelia recognized, a masterful thing. The compliment embedded in the expectation. The social leverage applied so smoothly, it felt like a gift. Mrs. Carver's expression flickered. Something recalculated behind her eyes. "Well," the woman said. She looked at Amelia again, and this time the look was different. Still measuring, but with the quality of someone who has revised their measure upward. "You'll need to call on me, formally, this week." "I'd be glad to," Amelia said. Mrs. Carver nodded once, with the gravity of a woman issuing a ruling, and moved away. The small crowd that had arranged itself at a carefully eavesdropping distance began slowly to redistribute itself. Elliot turned to look at her. "Thursday," he said. "I'll have Mrs. Aldridge send a note." "I heard her," Amelia said. "I know how to call on someone." "I know you do." The corner of his mouth moved. "I'm fairly certain you could call on the President of the United States and come away with a favorable impression." She looked at him. "That might be useful if Whitmore escalates further." His expression sobered slightly. "Yes," he said, "it might." She had not told him yet what she'd received 2 days prior. A second note, this one not unsigned. This one in a hand she didn't recognize, but carrying a return address in Richmond. She'd been turning it over, deciding what it meant, whether it was danger or information, or something else entirely. She told him now, standing in the churchyard in the full Virginia summer, with the congregation streaming around them. His stillness, when she finished, was the particular kind that preceded action rather than acceptance. "Richmond," he said. "The name on the note is a man named Gideon Marsh. He says he was Celeste's physician. He says he has information about her final weeks that Whitmore doesn't know he has." "What kind of information?" "He didn't say. He said only that it was something Celeste asked him to preserve." She paused. "And that he'd been waiting to contact someone he trusted with it." Elliot was quiet for a moment. "He contacted you?" "He contacted Mrs. Elliot Hargrove," she said. "Whether he knows who that actually is, I can't say." "We need to go to Richmond." "I thought you'd say that." "Tomorrow," he said, "if that suits you." She looked at him. 3 weeks ago, she had been a woman with no name and no options, standing at the top of a church aisle. She was being asked now, by her husband, whether a trip to Richmond suited her. The distance between those two things was not cartographic. It was something else entirely. "It suits me," she said. They rode to Richmond the next morning, a full day's travel in the heat, which Amelia bore considerably better than the carriage ride from the church to Hargrove Plantation a month ago, though the circumstances had changed enough that she thought this might be a factor. She had stopped white-knuckling things. She wasn't entirely sure when that had happened. Gideon Marsh was older than she'd expected, past 60, with the look of a man who had spent decades absorbing other people's difficult news, and had developed, out of professional necessity, a face that revealed very little. He received them in his office with the quiet efficiency of a man who had been waiting, and was glad not to wait any longer. He looked at Amelia first, then at Elliot, then back at Amelia. "You're not her," he said. Not accusatory, medical. The same tone he might use to note an irregular pulse. "No," she said. "I'm not." "Whitmore's doing?" "Yes." He nodded once, as if this confirmed something he'd half expected. "Sit down." He reached into his desk and brought out a small wooden box, the kind used for letters, smooth with handling. He set it on the desk between them. "Celeste gave me this 2 days before she died. She asked me to hold it until she could tell me who to give it to. She died before she could tell me." He looked at Amelia. "But she described the person. She said, "I'll tell you exactly what she said, because I wrote it down immediately after." She said, "Give it to the woman with the quiet eyes and the left hand. She'll know what to do with it." The room was very still. Amelia looked at the box. She looked at Elliot. He was watching her with an expression she'd learned to read by now. Open, in the small degree he allowed himself to be open. Waiting for whatever came next without trying to manage it in advance. She reached forward and took the box. Inside were 3 items. A letter, sealed, addressed to Elliot. A second letter, unsealed, with Amelia's name, her real name, written on the outside in Celeste's careful hand. And at the bottom of the box, a document, legal, notarized, bearing the stamp of a Richmond solicitor. She picked up the document first. It was a declaration, written in Celeste's hand and witnessed by Gideon Marsh and another name she didn't recognize. Dated 6 days before Celeste's death. It stated, in precise and unambiguous language, that Celeste Whitmore had been made aware of her father's intention to contract her marriage to Elliot Hargrove, despite her declining health, and that she formally requested, in the event of her death prior to the contracted date, that the marriage agreement be transferred to Amelia Carter, described as a woman of sound character and honest nature, with the full consent and blessing of the undersigning party. Amelia read it twice. "She consented," she said. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. "She did more than consent," Marsh said. "She arranged it, as much as she could arrange anything from a sickbed, with her father managing her affairs." He paused. She was a remarkable person. She was also furious at her father, which is what happens when you raise a bright woman and then treat her like a chess piece. Elliot was looking at the document over Amelia's shoulder. She felt him go still in a different way than she was accustomed to. Not the controlled stillness, but the genuine kind. The kind that happens when something lands that you didn't know you needed. "She chose," he said, quietly, to no one in particular. "She chose as well as she could from where she was," Marsh confirmed. "She couldn't stop her father. She couldn't unsign documents she'd never been shown. What she could do was make sure the right person ended up where she needed to be." He looked at Amelia. "She talked about you, you know, in those last days?" Amelia went very still. "What did she say?" "That you were the only person in the house who treated her like a person, rather than a problem to be managed. That you used to read to her in the afternoons, when her eyes were too tired." He paused. "She said you had the kind of backbone that doesn't make noise about itself. She said she trusted you with her name because names are the most important thing a person owns, and she wanted hers to go somewhere it would be handled right." The tightness in Amelia's chest was not grief exactly. It was something adjacent to grief. The feeling of understanding, too late to say it to the person's face, that you were seen more clearly than you knew. She opened the letter with her name on it. It was short, 2 paragraphs. She read it in silence, and she was not going to cry in a physician's office in Richmond. She was simply not going to do that, and she didn't. But it was close enough that she was aware of the specific effort involved. She folded it carefully. She put it in her pocket. She would read it again later, alone, when she had the space to let it be what it was. "The other letter," she said, and her voice was steady. "That's for you." She pushed it across the desk toward Elliot. He took it. He held it for a moment without opening it, looking at his own name in a dead woman's handwriting. Then he broke the seal and read. She watched his face while he read. She watched something move through it. Not emotion in the dramatic sense, but the quieter kind of emotion. The kind that happens deep and manifests only in small surface indicators if you know where to look. The set of his mouth, the slight change in his breathing, the way his hands held the letter. When he finished, he folded it and put it in his coat pocket. "Thank you," he said to Marsh, "for holding this." "She asked me to," the old man said simply. "That was enough." They didn't speak much on the road home. The day had gone long, and the heat was finally beginning to ease off as the sun dropped. And the silence between them was the kind that has weight in it. Not uncomfortable, but full, carrying things. It was Elliot who broke it. "She told me, in the letter, that she'd never wanted to marry me." He said it to the road ahead. "Not because of any fault of mine. She said she'd never wanted to marry anyone, that she'd wanted to study, which her father had never allowed, and that she'd made her peace with the arrangement because she had no real alternative." He paused. "She asked me not to grieve the loss of a marriage that neither of us chose. She said I'd be better served by choosing one myself when I was ready." Amelia listened. "She was very precise," he said, "even in a letter written from a deathbed." "She was," Amelia said. "She was the most practical person I've ever known." "She was also correct." He glanced at her, then back at the road. "About most things." She waited. He said nothing further, but he moved his horse slightly closer so they were riding shoulder to shoulder, and he didn't move away, and neither did she. They arrived home after dark. Mrs. Aldridge had kept supper warm and did not ask questions, which was one of many reasons Amelia had come, in the past weeks, to regard the woman as something close to essential. They ate. They were quiet. It was the good kind of quiet. She was at the stairs when he said, "Amelia." She turned. He was standing in the hallway with a letter from Richmond still in his coat pocket, and his expression carrying something she had not seen on him before. Not uncertainty exactly, because Elliot was not a man given to uncertainty, but something that acknowledged, openly and without management, that he was standing on ground he hadn't stood on before, and was making a choice about it. "I'm not a man who says things easily," he said. "You know that." "I do. So when I say something, I need you to understand that I've weighed it." She stood at the bottom of the stairs and looked at him. "All right." "I don't know what this is yet," he said. "Between us. I'm not going to call it something I can't prove. That's not how I work." He held her gaze. "But I know that this house is different with you in it. I know that I ride out to think, and I think about you. I know that the first thing I do when I come back is determine which room you're in." He paused. "I know that when Mrs. Carver planted herself in front of you this morning, I wanted to take her apart, piece by piece, and I am generally a patient man." She looked at him. Her chest was very full of something she didn't have a clean name for yet. "That's more words at once than I've heard from you in a month," she said. "I told you I'd weighed it." "Elliot." "I know what it is," she said. "Between us. You don't have to call it anything yet, but I know what it is." He looked at her for a long moment. "Tell me." "It's the beginning of something that's going to take a long time, and require a great deal of honesty and occasional stubbornness from both parties." She held his gaze. "I think we're both qualified." The corner of his mouth moved, then both corners, and Elliot Hargrove, who she had never once seen smile fully in all the weeks she'd known him, smiled, genuinely, unguardedly, in the way of a man who has stopped managing a thing and just let it happen. It changed his whole face. She stared at him for a moment, startled by it, the way you're startled by something beautiful that appears somewhere you'd stopped expecting beauty. "Go to bed, Amelia," he said, still smiling. Barely. Just enough. "Good night, Elliot," she said. She went up the stairs. She did not look back, because she understood instinctively that a man like Elliot Hargrove needed to be allowed the dignity of not being watched in his private moments. But she heard him, the quiet sound of him, standing in the hall a moment longer than necessary, before he finally moved. And that small sound, that single beat of hesitation in a man who hesitated at nothing, told her everything she needed to know. 3 weeks later, the Whitmore matter was formally closed. The falsified documents were entered into county record. The original debt agreement, the real one, recovered from her father's estate files by Fletcher, with a particular relish of a man doing work he was born for, showed zero balance. Every arrangement Whitmore had constructed on top of that fraudulent foundation collapsed with it. He left the county without announcing his departure. Someone said he'd gone to Georgia. Someone else said farther. Amelia did not ask. She found that she didn't need to know where a finished thing had gone. Margaret Hale sent a note when the Creek Strip deed was officially recorded in her name. The note contained 3 sentences. I have the water access. The Hale farm will survive another generation because of it. Celeste would have been insufferably pleased about this, which is the best possible outcome. Amelia read it aloud to Elliot at breakfast. He listened with his coffee cup halfway to his mouth and his expression doing the thing it did when he was privately amused. A certain quality of stillness that was, in fact, the precise opposite of stillness. She isn't wrong, he said. She isn't, Amelia agreed. She wrote Margaret back that afternoon. She told her about Richmond, about the box and the letters and the declaration. Margaret's response arrived 2 days later and contained 1 sentence. I know. She told me what she was planning. I thought you deserved to know that she was glad about you. Amelia held that letter for a long time. She was still holding it when Elliot appeared in the doorway of the library where she'd been sitting. He looked at her, at the letter. He didn't ask. She was glad, Amelia said. Celeste, about me being here. I'm glad too, he said, plain as a plank. No theater, no preamble. She looked at him. He crossed the room and sat down across from her, and leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, and looked at her directly, in the way he reserved for things that mattered. The full, unmanaged attention of a man who has decided something and is done deciding. I told you I'd weigh things before I said them, he said. You did. I've weighed this. He paused. I told you I didn't know what this was between us. I said I wouldn't call it something I couldn't prove. He held her gaze. I can prove it now. Her heartbeat was very loud. How? She asked. Because I've been afraid of it, he said. And I'm not afraid of things I don't care about. He reached across and took her hand, the left hand, the one with the ring that fit now. He held it the way he'd held it in the garden on the day everything was settled, steady and certain and without performance. I care about this. About you. I intend to keep doing so for a considerable length of time. She looked at their hands. Elliot, she said, that might be the most carefully worded declaration of love I have ever heard. I told you I don't say things easily. You also told me, when you say them, you've weighed them. I have. She turned her hand over and held his. Then I'll say it the way I know how to say things, she said, plainly, and without a great deal of ornamentation. She met his eyes. I love you. I think I started somewhere around the time you handed me a pair of garden gloves and didn't say a single word about the blood. She paused, which is perhaps an unconventional moment for it, but that's when it started. He looked at her for a long moment. The gloves, he said. The gloves. I'll keep that in mind. He squeezed her hand once. Then he stood and pulled her to her feet in one smooth motion, and stood close enough that she had to look up at him. And he looked down at her with those amber-brown eyes that had seen through her from the first moment in the church, and had chosen her anyway. And he said, very quietly, I love you, Amelia Carter. Her real name, in his voice, in a house that was hers, said by a man who knew exactly who she was, and had known longer than she'd been willing to believe. She rose up on her toes and kissed him before he could say anything further, because some things don't need more words, and this was one of them. He kissed her back, without management, without restraint, without any of the careful architecture he maintained between himself and the world. Just him, the man under all that steadiness, warmer than she'd known, and surer than she'd hoped, and exactly, precisely, right. When she pulled back, he was looking at her with that open expression she'd seen for the first time in the churchyard, and it still startled her, and she suspected it always would. And she found she didn't mind that at all. "The roses need work this afternoon," she said. "They do," he agreed. "I thought we might do it together." He looked at her. Then he looked at their joined hands. Then he looked at her again with a steadiness that held everything she'd spent her whole life not believing she would have. A home. A name that was hers. A man who saw her clearly and stayed. "I reckon we might," he said. They went out into the summer afternoon, side by side, into the garden where everything stubborn and worth keeping was coming back stronger than it was before. And Amelia Carter, not a substitute, not a shadow, not a dead woman's placeholder, but herself, fully and finally and without reservation, took her place in her own life and did not look back. She had walked through a church door wearing a lie, and she had found, on the other side of it, the only true thing she had ever been given. A man who chose her before she knew she deserved choosing. A house that became a home, one honest day at a time. And a name, her own, plain, unadorned name, that was worth more than any she had ever borrowed. That was the whole of the story. And it was enough.